Have you ever stood in front of a massive, intricate tapestry, stepping so close to the fabric that all you could see were chaotic, disconnected threads? That is precisely how most of us experience the Bible. We open it, read a scattered verse here, an isolated story there, and often find ourselves lost in a labyrinth of ancient genealogies, complex laws, and prophetic visions that seem completely detached from our modern reality. I remember my own early attempts to read through this monumental text. I felt completely overwhelmed. Here is a library of 66 separate books, penned by over 40 different authors, ranging from kings and scholars to fishermen and shepherds, spanning across 1,500 years of turbulent human history, and written across 3 different continents in 3 different languages. The sheer scale of it creates an intellectual vertigo. It is incredibly easy to lose the forest for the trees, to miss the grand, unifying narrative, because we are too busy trying to untangle the localized histories of the ancient Near East. But what if I told you that hidden, right in the middle of this vast library, is a miniature blueprint? A perfectly scaled microcosm of the entire biblical epic, hiding in plain sight. This is the profound mystery of the book of Isaiah. For centuries, scholars and theologians have studied Isaiah for its rich poetic language and its astonishingly accurate prophecies. Yet, millions of readers completely miss the structural miracle embedded within its chapters. Isaiah is not just a prophetic book, it is a fractal of the entire Bible. The numbers alone are too precise to be dismissed as mere coincidence. The Bible contains 66 books. The book of Isaiah contains exactly 66 chapters. But the rabbit hole goes much deeper than basic arithmetic. The thematic and structural parallels between the 66 chapters of Isaiah and the 66 books of the Bible are so meticulously aligned that they force us to reconsider everything we know about how this ancient text was compiled. As I began to study this, my perspective shifted from viewing the Bible as a chaotic anthology to seeing it as a singular, brilliantly orchestrated symphony. Isaiah serves as the master key. It is the decoder ring that unlocks the overarching narrative of human history, from the dawn of creation to the ultimate restoration of the cosmos. By understanding the architecture of Isaiah, we suddenly understand the architecture of the divine mind, realizing that the story of humanity is not a series of random accidents, but a carefully woven tapestry where every single thread has a designated purpose. To truly grasp the magnitude of this blueprint, we have to look at how the Bible is fundamentally divided. The overarching biblical narrative is split into 2 distinct testaments: the Old Testament, containing 39 books, and the New Testament, containing 27 books. Now, open the book of Isaiah. You will find that it is sharply divided into 2 distinct sections, pivoting perfectly between chapter 39 and chapter 40. Let us look deeply into the first 39 chapters of Isaiah. The thematic resonance with the 39 books of the Old Testament is unmistakable. The Old Testament is a narrative characterized by the establishment of God's supreme holiness, the giving of the law, the repeated failures of humanity to uphold that law, and the inevitable, thunderous consequences of rebellion. It is a story of a tragic cycle. Human beings trying to secure their own salvation, building earthly empires, forging fragile political alliances, and ultimately fracturing under the weight of their own moral corruption. This is exactly what we see in the first 39 chapters of Isaiah. The prophet writes during one of the most volatile and terrifying periods in ancient history. The geopolitical landscape was dominated by the Assyrian Empire, a brutal, relentless war machine that swept across the Middle East, flaying their enemies alive and leaving mountains of skulls in their wake. In the face of this existential threat, the nation of Israel panicked. Instead of turning to the spiritual foundations that had birthed their nation, their leaders scrambled to form desperate political alliances with Egypt and Babylon. They sought salvation in chariots and wealth, trusting in the tangible power of human empires rather than the invisible sovereign of the universe. Isaiah's voice cuts through this panic like lightning in a dark sky. For 39 chapters, he delivers a relentless, unyielding message of divine justice, moral accountability, and the absolute sovereignty of a holy God. He dismantles their political strategies, exposing the futility of trusting in broken human systems. As I read through these chapters, I cannot help but see a reflection of our own modern human condition. How often do we, when faced with personal or societal crises, frantically search for salvation in our own Egypts, whether that be wealth, technology, political saviors, or social status? The first 39 chapters of Isaiah hold up a mirror to the pride and stubbornness of the human heart. It is a heavy, weighty section of Scripture, filled with warnings, judgments, and the grim reality of sin. And just as the 39 books of the Old Testament end with the tragic reality of God's people being exiled from their land, defeated and broken, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah conclude with a chilling, devastating prophecy. In Isaiah chapter 39, the prophet looks King Hezekiah in the eye and foretells the coming Babylonian captivity, a moment where all their wealth, their temples, and their children will be carried off into a foreign land. The curtain falls on chapter 39 in absolute darkness, leaving the reader in a state of unresolved tension and profound grief, perfectly mirroring the bitter, silent end of the Old Testament era. History tells us that after the final book of the Old Testament was written, a heavy, deafening silence fell over the nation of Israel. For 400 years, there were no prophets, no divine revelations, no burning bushes, and no parting seas. It was a prolonged, agonizing winter of the soul, a chasm of time where a conquered people waited in the dark, wondering if God had finally abandoned them to the ashes of their own mistakes. This historical gap is perfectly represented by the white space that separates Isaiah chapter 39 from Isaiah chapter 40. When you turn the page from chapter 39 to chapter 40, you are not just moving to the next section of a book. You are crossing a massive theological and historical threshold. The transition is so abrupt, so radical in its shift of tone, that for a long time, skeptical scholars argued it must have been written by a completely different person. But they missed the poetic brilliance of the design. Chapter 40 shatters the silence not with a roar of condemnation, but with a sudden, overwhelming dawn of grace. The very first words of Isaiah 40 are, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned." It is an emotional whiplash. Imagine being a prisoner of war, sitting in a dark, damp cell for decades, completely resigned to dying in chains, and suddenly the heavy iron doors swing open, flooding the room with blinding sunlight as someone announces that your ransom has been paid in full. That is the psychological and spiritual impact of moving into this second section of Isaiah. The tone shifts entirely from the fierce declaration of God's unattainable holiness to the tender, intimate revelation of God's redemptive love. The long, exhausting era of trying to earn salvation through the law is over. The era of unmerited grace has aggressively burst onto the scene. This brings us to the astonishing realization that the final 27 chapters of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 66, serve as a perfect mirror for the 27 books of the New Testament. The New Testament begins with the 4 Gospels, and right at the start of those Gospels, we are introduced to a wild, eccentric figure living in the desert, John the Baptist. He is the herald, the one preparing the way for the Messiah. Where does the New Testament get the vocabulary to describe him? Directly from the opening lines of Isaiah 40. A voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." The 27 books of the New Testament and the 27 concluding chapters of Isaiah begin with the exact same announcement. But the parallels become even more breathtaking as we dive deeper into the core of the Christian message. The absolute beating heart of the New Testament is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The early Christians did not have the New Testament documents compiled yet. They preached the gospel using the Old Testament, and their primary text was the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Written 7 centuries before the Roman Empire even perfected the cruel art of crucifixion, Isaiah 53 provides a biometric, psychological, and spiritual autopsy of the suffering Messiah. It is here that Isaiah develops the concept of the suffering servant. In the ancient world, people expected salvation to come riding on a war horse. They wanted a political conqueror, a military genius who would slaughter their enemies and establish an earthly utopia. We still want that today, don't we? We constantly look for strong men and powerful leaders to force the world into shape. Yet, Isaiah intricately details a Savior who does the exact opposite. He speaks of a man who has no form or majesty that we should look at him, a man who is despised and rejected, who bore our griefs and carried our sorrows. He prophesies that this servant will be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities, and that by his wounds we are healed. When I sit quietly and meditate on Isaiah 53, I am deeply moved by the quiet, subversive nature of divine love. It completely inverts the human power pyramid. The ultimate victory over evil was not won through violence, coercion, or political dominance, but through a radical, self-sacrificing surrender. This is the central thesis of the 27 books of the New Testament, laid out with forensic precision in the center of Isaiah's final 27 chapters. Furthermore, as the New Testament progresses from the Gospels into the book of Acts and the Epistles, the narrative expands. The message of salvation breaks out of the ethnic and geographic confines of Israel and spills over into the Gentile world, reaching the furthest corners of the Roman Empire. This explosive, horizontal expansion of grace is explicitly detailed in Isaiah. In chapter 49, God tells the servant, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." The entire missionary movement of the early church, the radical inclusion of outcasts, foreigners, and enemies into the family of God, was not a sudden pivot or a plan B because the Jewish leaders rejected Jesus. It was the eternal blueprint. It was written into the fabric of the text hundreds of years before the first apostle ever set foot on a boat. The 27 chapters of Isaiah's second half perfectly map out the theological trajectory of the 27 books of the New Testament, beginning with the herald in the wilderness, climaxing at the substitutionary sacrifice of the suffering servant, and exploding outward into a global movement of grace. If this structural symmetry holds true, then we must look at how both the Bible and the book of Isaiah conclude. The final books of the New Testament, culminating in the book of Revelation, pull back the cosmic curtain to reveal the ultimate destiny of humanity and the universe. Revelation does not end with the annihilation of the earth, as many apocalyptic movies would have us believe. Instead, it ends with a profound vision of cosmic renewal. The Apostle John, exiled on the island of Patmos, writes of a staggering reality. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away." He describes a reality where God dwells with humanity, where every tear is wiped away, and where death, mourning, crying, and pain are permanently eradicated. It is the restoration of the Garden of Eden, but magnified into a glorious, eternal city. The narrative of the Bible is a perfect circle. It begins in Genesis with a perfect creation that is broken by human rebellion, and it ends in Revelation with a broken creation completely restored by divine grace. Astonishingly, when we turn to the final 2 chapters of the book of Isaiah, chapters 65 and 66, we find the exact same visionary climax. In Isaiah 65:17, God declares, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind." Isaiah writes of a time when the wolf and the lamb shall graze together, when the fundamental hostilities of nature itself are subdued, and when weeping and distress will be heard no more. The architectural parallel is flawless. The 66-chapter book of Isaiah concludes with the exact same eschatological vision as the 66-book library of the Bible. It is a promise that despite the chaos, the bloodshed, the exile, and the suffering detailed in the earlier chapters, the story ends in unimaginable beauty. It tells us that history is not a meaningless, infinite loop of suffering, but a purposeful timeline moving toward a definitive, redemptive conclusion. The end of the book perfectly matches the end of the book. Why does this profound, hidden architecture actually matter to you and me? It matters because it forcefully challenges the modern, cynical view that the Bible is merely a disjointed, chaotic collection of Bronze Age myths, heavily edited by power-hungry men over centuries. The mathematical and thematic symmetry between the 66 chapters of Isaiah and the 66 books of the Bible strongly suggests something infinitely more complex. It points to a singular, transcendent mind orchestrating the narrative across generations, empires, and millennia. It is a divine signature written in the very structure of the text, a watermark of authenticity that defies human engineering. When you recognize this blueprint, you stop reading the Bible as a chaotic historical archive and begin experiencing it as a living, breathing masterpiece of divine communication. But beyond the intellectual awe, there is a deeply personal psychological comfort to be found in this structure. Life, in many ways, perfectly mimics this biblical layout. Many of us spend a significant portion of our lives living in our own first 39 chapters. We experience periods of intense struggle, profound failure, the heavy consequences of our own bad decisions, and the painful realization that our self-made empires cannot save us. We live in the tension of chapter 39, staring into the dark, feeling exiled from our own peace, wondering if we have ruined our story beyond repair. The structural revelation of Isaiah whispers a profound truth into that darkness. Chapter 39 is never the end of the story. There is a chapter 40 waiting. There is a pivot point of unmerited grace, a voice crying in the wilderness of your specific pain, announcing that your warfare can end and that comfort is available. The overarching message of this 66-chapter microcosm is that God's grand narrative, and by extension, the narrative He desires for your life, always moves from the exhaustion of human effort to the liberating rest of divine grace, culminating in ultimate restoration. The book of Isaiah is not just the key to understanding the entire Bible, It is the key to understanding the trajectory of redemption itself. It invites us to stop desperately trying to build our own salvation in the first half of the book, and to boldly step into the unearned, staggering grace of the second half.